Family and Consumer Sciences Extension at the University of Kentucky. Our agents share research knowledge with individuals, families, and communities to improve quality of life. Building strong families, building Kentucky. It starts with us.
Hello, my name is Vicki Wynn, and I'm the Family and Consumer Sciences Agent at the Marshall County Extension Office in Benton, Kentucky. Today we're going to talk about baking for one, two, or a few. As you all probably know, baking in itself is a science. It's an exact science because the elements that we all measure and put together before baking needs to be in the proper portions, needs to be according to a recipe, and it needs to be according to the way it's put together, the temperature, the size of dish that you bake it in, and all of these things come together so that you have a good end result. So sometimes in talking about baking for one, two, or a few, we need to alter an original recipe. We need to take it and scale it down to half or even a third or a fourth. And there are some steps that we can take in order to make that turn out the way it should. And we have to be careful with our portions, proportions, and all of the things that go into that recipe to make it come out with a good end result. So first of all, we want to talk about some of the basic equipment that you will need. And there are a few things that are very helpful in the process of baking for smaller numbers. The first thing would be your mixing bowls. As you can see, the size from a standard mixing bowl to a smaller mixing bowl, this one would be much more appropriate for a recipe that has been scaled down, that you might be cooking for one or two, and it is much easier to work with, much easier to maintain, clean, all those things. So we want to make sure that we are using appropriate size equipment for putting together these recipes. Some of the other things that we need to have are rubber scrapers, and we highly recommend the silicone now that the rubber scrapers and spoons, a lot of other small utensils are made out of now. They're very heat resistant. They stay in good condition for a lot longer than a lot of the other rubber type scrapers. The silicone is much easier to take care of, and it lasts a lot longer. And they come in different sizes. As you can see, if you're using a small container or a smaller bowl, you might not need one of the larger size. So these do come in smaller sizes. They also come in spoons and other utensils, also out of the silicone. There's even a whisk, which typically is made out of wire, but the silicone coated wire is also very easy to use and easy to maintain. So we have all of these that really work well together with our recipes in the smaller containers. We also need to look at our baking pans. We have baking sheets. These come in much smaller sizes, and this makes it easier to prepare a smaller version of your recipe. This is ideal for one or two people. So this is very handy. It's easier to handle. You can take care of that much easier than a much larger one, and it's just much more convenient to have. It also takes less area to store these, so it's good for us to make sure that we have what is adaptable to our needs. And of course, the pans, these glass baking pans, there is one of the 8x8, and it is more convenient to use for that smaller amount than this large 9x13. So we want to make sure that our recipe is going to be compatible with the baking sheet or the pans. We also have loaf pans that come in different sizes, the smaller ones. And if you will look at your recipe when you are putting together to make these breads. Usually quick breads are what is made in the loaf pans. Of course, the smaller size, and then you have the larger size. But converting your recipe, for example, this fall spiced pumpkin bread, it calls for an 8x4-inch loaf pan, and that would be this size. So these are smaller, and not necessarily 2 of these equals one of the larger one, but we have to make sure that whatever portion that we are going to be making is going to fit into those size pans. In addition to these, we have muffin tins, and even a 6-well muffin tin would be appropriate. Of course, the mini muffins make a lot of muffins, and at the end of the program, we'll talk about making a full batch and freezing for later, or freezing for giving as a gift, or there are some other options. Even though this program is primarily about scaling down recipes, there are times you want to make a full recipe and what you can do to preserve that extra or the larger quantity. So all of these things are suitable depending on your needs. A look at some of the other small tools that are very handy. Of course, we've talked about the scraper out of the silicone. Also a handheld can opener. It's not necessary to have one of the larger counter models, electric can opener, this smaller one, and this is one that actually lifts the lid off. It's the safety feature, so there's no rough edges, and this one is highly recommended because it is easy to use and it is much safer. We also have liquid and dry measuring cups. Of course, the dry measuring cups, it's very handy to have an 1/8 of a cup. This one is labeled 2 tablespoons, which is an 1/8 of a cup. But 2 tablespoons, frequently you'll see this one used in measuring for coffee makers. And you have that in your set of measuring cups, and of course these are dry measuring cups, and it's good to have a set of those with all the different quantity amounts on there. Of course, measuring spoons, and it also has a 1/8 of a teaspoon. These are very handy when you're making smaller recipes, when you're making recipes that call for fewer ingredients or smaller quantities of ingredients. So these are very, very good to have with all of the different amounts. This one even came with a scraper, and it can level your ingredients off. So be sure when you're reading your recipe and measuring that you're always making the proper amount when you measure those out. And of course, a liquid measuring cup. These come in all sizes. You've probably seen some that will hold many cups. This is a 1 cup. They come 2 cup, 4 cup, 8 cup, and there's larger measuring cups in this type of cup. But just know that this one will probably meet your needs in terms of measuring those ingredients, making sure that you have the right quantity that your recipe calls for, or if you've adapted a recipe, that you are able to see the measurements and know that you're getting the proper amount. We also have some ice cube trays, and we'll talk a little bit about why these are very useful. And again, these are the silicone ice cube trays, and we would use these for some ingredients that maybe you're not going to use all of it. We're going to talk about eggs, we're going to talk about milk, some of your perishable ingredients that you don't use a full amount with. And it's good to have these little ice cube trays. And these in the silicone will last much longer than the hard plastic. I grew up using those hard plastic ones, and you twist and the ice cubes pop out. After time, they crack, they'll break, so they're really not as durable as the silicone ones are, and they're relatively very inexpensive. So we want to make sure that we're protecting our investment there. So also another tool, small kitchen gadget, is a kitchen scale, and it's good to have on hand if you have converted a recipe, you're scaling down, and you want to be very consistent, because you can weigh your ingredients and half the weight for your recipe, and you can know that you're being very consistent with all your ingredients, because we know that weight measurements and volume measurements do not equate the same. And it's really good to have a scale so that you know you are getting the proper proportions there. So after we've read our recipe and we've seen all the ingredients that are needed and that we can scale those down in quantities, it's fairly easy to scale down using flour, sugar, brown sugar, and after we've measured properly with each of those, and knowing that these ingredients are going to contribute to that recipe, and then the portion of eggs, if that's listed in your recipe. Of course, the pumpkin bread calls for, let's see, 2 eggs. So if we half that recipe, 1 egg is fairly easy to handle. Now, if we had a bread recipe that called for 1 egg and we had to half that egg, that means we're going to have to break that egg, take a fork or a little one of the wire whisk or silicone whisk there, and combine it, make sure that it's thoroughly combined. A half of that large egg would be about 1.5 teaspoons. So we know it can be halved, but we would need to know what to do with that other part. That's where our ice cube trays come in handy. You can freeze the remainder of that egg. If you have eggs you're not going to use and you feel like they're past their use date, then you can freeze in the ice cube tray, and you need to use them within 1 year. So they do last quite a long time. You would need to thaw those, use those in dishes that are going to be cooked. So for example, more bread or a cake or some cookies, those recipes will be cooked. Your egg has been properly stored in the freezer, and you can use that to make another recipe. So it's good to have that option. I looked for frozen eggs and egg substitutes at the grocery store. I went to 3 different grocery stores, and it's harder and harder to find those frozen eggs. You can find a lot of egg whites, but it was difficult to find any of the frozen eggs or egg substitutes of whole eggs. And they're very easy to use if you can find them, but once they are opened, then you need to make sure that they're properly stored and you can continue to use them by the date that is on the package. So another challenge that we have with ingredients that have expiration dates and we might not be able to use, of course, milk and buttermilk. There are substitutions that we can use. Of course, the dry powdered milk is very easy to use. It comes in smaller packages. This is one of the smaller packages that I found, but there are lots of options with that, and also with the dried buttermilk. I know some recipes will call for buttermilk, and typically I will make my own buttermilk. It's sort of a substitution of buttermilk. I'll put about a teaspoon of vinegar or a teaspoon of lemon juice, an acid, in a regular milk to make my buttermilk. But this by far is the most effective and the safest to use. You have it on hand. You can keep this in after it's been opened for a long, long time. It will keep up to 2 years, and it won't lose its effectiveness. So the dry buttermilk and the dry powdered milk are very good options. You can mix the proportion in with your recipe and the added water to reconstitute that with the liquid, and you can mix it all together, or you can mix it up separately. I have some small bowls that are very handy in the kitchen when you're trying to mix a small quantity, and these come in a lot of different sizes, but it's easier to mix than, say, a mixing bowl. So if you're going to do a small amount, it's handy to have these smaller containers. But the milk and the buttermilk most definitely are options, and you should be able to find those in any local store. Okay, now we're going to move on to pan equivalents, and if, let's say you're going to be using that recipe for quick bread, for pumpkin bread or for banana bread, and you really want to make the small container rather than the large. So this recipe calls for the larger pan. And what you can do is fill this up with water, measure it, and then fill one of these up with water, measure it, and see how much it will translate to. So you've got the recipe is calling for this size, but do you think you can get 2 of these out of this? It's a good test to fill with water, measure, and see if you can make that the same. Now, when you do refigure those recipes, you want to make sure that you keep the same temperature, and the cooking time will be decreased. But as long as you have the level the same, let's say you're going to fill this half full, and if you're making smaller ones, you're going to fill them half full as well. It's going to still cook at, let's say, 350 degrees, but of course the cooking time is going to be decreased. And we have a handout that we have here at the office. If you would stop by, we have all the pan equivalents listed. That it's very handy if you are following a recipe and yet you want it to be more geared to whatever your needs are, 1 or 2 people or the much smaller size. Just stop by or call our office. We'd be glad to mail or email you one of those handouts that has all of that information. So the chart is a general guide to pan size, and that is in the handout that I referenced, and it is very, very handy if you are going to be scaling back some of your favorite recipes to a smaller size. Let's talk a little bit about baking times. When the recipe is changed to yield fewer servings, the baking time will need to be decreased. So let's say in this mini muffin pan, it's going to take 10 to 15 minutes to bake these, whereas a regular size muffin is going to take 15 to 28 minutes. So you can see it's almost double. It's 1.5 times to double. So you want to make sure that it is enough time. You might have to experiment with that a little bit, especially transferring it to the small. You don't want to overbake, and of course the smaller ones are going to take less time, so it's going to require a little more watchful eye about that. And it's always good if you have scaled back a recipe. If you are looking at making a smaller muffin or loaf in the quick bread loaf, you want to jot that on your recipe. If you've scaled it back, jot down how much time was different, if the temperature was sufficient, and make sure that you reference that for future use. So once you have had success with scaling that recipe back and knowing that it worked, then that's a good thing. Another thing I want to mention is a hand mixer is usually very effective for a smaller mixing bowl and for the recipes that have been scaled back for 1 or 2 people. And it's one of those things that we don't use it often, but it serves us well. It's not as expensive as some of the bench mixers, and we want to make sure that we maintain it well, we keep the beaters clean. This one also comes with one of the wire whisk, so it's really a good tool to have in the kitchen. We want to make sure that we take good care of these. And when talking about ingredients, just a note of reference here, a good recipe is written with the ingredients in the order that you will use them. So this one starts with the flour, the baking powder, the baking soda, and the pumpkin pie spice, and also a little bit of salt. So those are the first ingredients that are mentioned, and those will be combined for your recipe. So it's always good to get out all your ingredients so you know that you have what is called for in that recipe. You want to make sure that you have the quantities that you're wanting to make. You may have scaled back this recipe, and of course you would want to jot that down on another sheet of paper or a Post-it note that you could add to this recipe. So the order that they are coming in. Also, this makes a reference to 1/2 cup of melted margarine. So as you all know, margarine or butter or shortening of any kind can be added to a recipe in a lot of different ways. We want to make sure that it doesn't say softened or cold. Sometimes it will ask you to blend it in cold, and this one has melted. So we want to make sure that we interpret it properly. Some recipes that call for 1 cup of chopped walnuts. Well, there's a difference in 1 cup of chopped walnuts and 1 cup of walnuts chopped. So interpret that recipe. They will definitely be different quantities if you're not putting them together in the way that it says. So we want to make sure that we have taken all of these into mind as far as getting our ingredients together, getting all of the things as they need to be added and in the order on the recipe. Another thing that I wanted to mention, this is a quick bread recipe we've talked about, but yeast. If you're making yeast breads, yeast rolls, yeast cinnamon rolls, there's just a lot of recipes that call for yeast. These are typically what you find at the grocery store in packets. And of course, on the back it says 1 package of this yeast measures about 2 1/4 teaspoons. So if you have scaled your recipe back and it calls for 1 package, you're going to need to measure out what is in this packet and divide it accordingly to how you want to scale that recipe back. It seems to be easier if you would have the jar of yeast and you could measure it out. If you have halved your recipe and it calls for the packet that has 2 1/4 teaspoons, you could just measure out 1 1/8 teaspoon that would equal that. So, and this yeast will last forever practically. If you keep it in the freezer, this jar of yeast would last a long time. The same would go for, these are chocolate or cocoa squares that a lot of people use for cakes, cookies, brownies. And on this particular one, it says on the package that 4 pieces equal 1 ounce. So 4 of the squares, and they are divided into squares, as you can see, 4 of these. It takes 4 to make 1 ounce. And a lot of your recipes will call for 2 ounces of baking chocolate or 2 ounces of cocoa in this solid form. So you want to make sure that you translate that properly and add those desired amounts. So recipes are scaled to increase or decrease the desired portions that you want. Just making sure that you've read the recipe properly, that you have gotten your ingredients. Some recipes work well with this, some not so much. So you may have to experiment and make sure that it yields the desired outcome. You may want to, like we mentioned, measure those by weight and see if that is easier for you or more accurate in terms of coming out with a good end product. So while this program focused mainly on scaling back recipes and knowing how to alter your ingredient amounts, there are times that you want to bake a whole recipe. You want to make a regular batch, and let's say for the muffins, you decide, you know, I enjoy having a couple of muffins occasionally, but there's no way I could eat this many. So that is when you can make the batch, you can store some of those in the freezer, and of course making sure you have freezer bags and that you have a permanent marker to label those as to when you made them, and that is good to have for another day, or you can share those with other people. So knowing that it's your option, your choice. You can decide what is best for you, what yield you're interested in making. And with the holiday season, a lot of people do want to bake the normal size recipe or the normal quantity, and then you can divide that and share with others. So I thank you for joining in today. Again, if you would like to have a copy of the Baking for One, Two, or a Few, we have those here at the office, and we're most glad to see you when you come in, and be glad to get those for you. So thank you for joining us.